The evening began with a phone call from my wife's friend, Emily. She seemed unusually enthusiastic, her voice bubbling with excitement. Apparently, she had recently switched jobs, now working at some fancy firm that paid well and had a crowd she seemed keen on impressing. She wanted us to come along and meet her new colleagues and their extended circle. Emily explained that she'd feel out of place without familiar faces around, and she figured we could make it a bit more comfortable for her. My wife listened attentively, nodding along to Emily's rapid explanations. When Emily mentioned the plan was for tonight, my wife barely hesitated before agreeing. She assured Emily we'd be there and asked her to send the location. After the call, I sighed and leaned back in my chair. I was planning to crack open a beer and relax at home tonight, I told her plainly. "Oh, come on," she replied, rolling her eyes. "Don't be such a grump. Besides, we might meet some interesting people. It'll be fun." Her enthusiasm was hard to argue against, and though I wasn't thrilled about heading out, I figured it wouldn't hurt to show some support. "Fine," I said with a shrug. "Let's go." By the time we arrived at the venue, the sky had turned a deep indigo, and the neon sign of Pink Freund buzzed faintly above the entrance. The place was lively, with groups scattered around under strings of fairy lights. It was a hipster hangout, the kind of spot that served craft beer with names you couldn't pronounce and probably charged extra for the ambience. I didn't care much for the scene, but I kept my thoughts to myself. My wife spotted Emily waving us over to a corner where a group of people sat at a cluster of mismatched chairs and tables. We approached, and introductions began. Most faces blurred together for me, but one guy stood out. He was animated, gesturing wildly as he recounted some story that had the group's attention. He looked like he belonged here, with his casual yet curated outfit and a confidence that suggested he enjoyed being the center of attention. We exchanged names, a few pleasantries, and settled into the group dynamic. The conversation flowed easily enough, with people chiming in and out, but I kept an eye on everyone, more out of habit than necessity. As the evening went on, I noticed something odd about the guy, let's call him Jason. He had a way of looking at my wife that didn't sit right with me. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. But then it became impossible to ignore. His gaze lingered a second too long, his smile a little too knowing. It wasn't overt, but it was there. I decided to address it directly. "Something wrong?" I asked him during a pause in the conversation. My tone was even, but I didn't bother sugarcoating the question. Jason looked at me, taken aback for a split second, before shaking his head. "No, not at all," he said smoothly. Then, with a slight smirk, he asked, "So, what's your deal? You two dating or what?" "We're married," I said firmly. My answer was simple, but my tone left no room for interpretation. "Got it," Jason replied, raising his eyebrows and leaning back. "No questions, then." The conversation shifted after that, but his demeanor left a sour taste. He carried on as if nothing had happened, blending back into the group dynamic effortlessly, but I didn't miss the way he still looked at my wife when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The rest of the evening felt like a balancing act. I stayed engaged in the conversations, keeping things light for my wife's sake, but I remained aware of Jason's behavior. It didn't help that he kept positioning himself near my wife, cracking jokes and steering conversations in her direction. She was polite as always, oblivious to the undercurrents. I wasn't about to make a scene, but I was ready to shut it down if he crossed the line. By the time we wrapped up and the group started to disperse, Jason's behavior hadn't changed. His glances lingered a fraction too long, his smiles too frequent. I kept my irritation in check, focusing on making our exit without incident. As we walked to the car, I mentally noted how the night unfolded, already deciding I wouldn't forget Jason anytime soon. The drive home started quietly, with just the hum of the car engine and the occasional sound of tires rolling over uneven pavement. I glanced at my wife, who was scrolling through her phone, seemingly relaxed after the evening out. But the more I thought about that guy, Jason, with his smug smirk and wandering eyes, the angrier I got. Finally, I broke the silence. "You saw how he rolled his eyes, right?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even but failing. "Who, Jason?" she replied without looking up. "Oh, come on. He was harmless." "Harmless?" I repeated, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "The guy was practically drooling over you." It was ridiculous. My words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, she didn't respond. When she finally did, her tone was casual, almost teasing. "Well, I can't help it if I'm attractive," she said, flashing a playful smile. "Every woman likes a little attention now and then." I turned to her sharply, my expression hard. "So you liked it? That's what you're saying?" My voice was clipped, each word landing like a stone. Her smile faded, and she held up her hands defensively. "Of course not," she said quickly. "I'm just saying you don't need to take it so seriously. He's probably like that with everyone. You should let it go." I didn't reply immediately, focusing instead on the road ahead. After a moment, she shifted in her seat and changed the subject. "You know, while you were driving, I was thinking about something," she began. "Emily's new job seems pretty great. I'm thinking of applying there too." That caught my attention. "How did you come to that decision?" I asked, genuinely curious. She shrugged lightly. "Well, Emily said there's an opening, and it's exactly in my field. Plus, the pay is better," she explained. "I think it's time for a change." I considered her words carefully. "So, when's the interview?" I asked. "And how much are they offering?" She hesitated briefly before answering. "The interview is tomorrow," she said. "But it's not going to be a typical interview. It's more informal, you know. They're coming to our place instead." I raised an eyebrow at that. "To our place? That's unusual. Shouldn't you be going to their office?" "Well, it's kind of through connections," she admitted. "Emily's setting it up for me. It'll be easier to manage this way, don't you think?" I sighed, still not entirely convinced but not wanting to argue. "All right," I said finally. "If that's how it's done, then fine." The day started early for me as I focused on getting the house ready for the evening. My wife had mentioned that the interview would be informal, but I wasn't one to do things halfway. If we were hosting, everything needed to be just right. To add a special touch, I decided to drive out to my father's farm to pick up the best cut of meat he had. He didn't disappoint, handing over a marbled steak that looked like it belonged on the cover of a food magazine. By the time I got back home, I had already planned how to prepare it. I marinated the meat carefully, paying attention to every detail to make sure it would turn out perfect. As the hours ticked by, the house was spotless, and the smell of marinated steak wafted through the air. Everything was set. Then came the knock at the door. I opened it to find my wife's friend Emily and, to my surprise, Jason standing beside her. My jaw tightened instinctively, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I leaned toward my wife and quietly asked, "What is he doing here?" She gave me a calm look and whispered back, "He's the HR guy. He's the one conducting my interview." That didn't sit well with me, but I nodded and stepped aside to let them in. As we moved to the living room, I kept my expression neutral, though inside, my thoughts were anything but. Everyone took their seats, and the atmosphere felt more like a casual get-together than anything else. I busied myself with setting up the table and serving drinks, but I couldn't help noticing how Emily seemed to gravitate toward Jason. At one point, she leaned in close to him, and I caught a glimpse of him taking her hand. It was subtle, but it was there. I clenched my jaw, reminding myself to stay focused on the evening's purpose. For the first hour, it was all small talk and laughter. Jason seemed to be enjoying himself, playing the role of the charming guest. Then, finally, he shifted gears and began discussing the job. He outlined the company's structure, the team dynamics, and what my wife's responsibilities would entail. He spoke confidently, and my wife listened attentively, asking questions and nodding along. It was all very professional, but I couldn't shake the unease lingering in the back of my mind. By the time the discussion wrapped up, it seemed like everyone was on the same page. Jason appeared satisfied, and my wife seemed optimistic. As we stood to clear the table, Jason pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to my wife. "Before you start," he said, "there's one more step. You'll need to meet with me separately so I can introduce you to the boss. It's standard procedure." That caught my attention. "Why can't she meet him at the office?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. My wife touched my arm lightly and said, "It's fine. Emily went through the same thing, right?" Emily nodded quickly, backing Jason up. "Yes, it's just how they do things," she said. "They'll go over her salary and final details. Nothing unusual." With that, the evening wound down. Everyone seemed satisfied with how things had gone, and after a few more pleasantries, our guests left. The house was finally quiet again. Exhausted from the day's efforts and the tension of the evening, we barely spoke as we headed to bed. By the time our heads hit the pillows, we were out cold, too tired to dwell on anything further. The next morning, over breakfast, I couldn't help but bring up the lingering thought. "So, are they a couple?" I asked, referring to Emily and Jason. My wife glanced up from her coffee and nodded. "Yeah, they've been seeing each other for a while now," she replied casually. I set my mug down with a slight thud. "I still don't like the way he looks at you," I said bluntly. She sighed, giving me the kind of look people reserve for someone overreacting. "Oh, stop it," she said, shaking her head. "He's with Emily, and you're making something out of nothing." "Making something out of nothing?" I repeated, leaning back in my chair. "I've got eyes." He wasn't exactly subtle. She waved me off as if swatting a fly, her tone turning light. "You're overthinking it. Besides, Emily was telling me they've been trying something unusual lately." That piqued my interest. "Unusual?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Like what?" She smirked slightly and said, "I'll tell you tonight. I've got to run now, Jason and I are meeting the boss." With that, she grabbed her bag, kissed me on the cheek, and left. I stared after her, the conversation leaving me unsettled. Later that day, while taking a break, I called one of my friends to share my thoughts. "Man, this whole process feels off," I said. "It's like she's interviewing for the mafia or something." My friend laughed but agreed. "It does sound weird. I've worked corporate too, but nothing's ever been that secretive. You hear things about some companies, though, especially when it comes to upper management and their preferences." I grunted in response, not entirely sure what to make of it. "I guess every company's different," I said, trying to dismiss the unease building in my chest. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and by the time evening rolled around, I was ready for some answers. When she got home, she was all smiles. "Guess what? I got the job," she announced, dropping her bag onto the couch. "That's great," I said, genuinely happy for her but still curious. "So, how'd it go?" "It was fine," she said, sitting beside me. "Jason and I had a good chat on the way back, and he told me something interesting. Turns out, he and Emily tried a swinger party recently." My eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me?" She laughed at my reaction, continuing. "Yeah, can you believe it? They even invited us to try it." I stared at her, processing the information. "Does Emily even know about this invitation?" I asked. "Of course," she replied. "She's the one who brought it up." I shook my head firmly. "That's not happening." She looked a little disappointed but didn't argue. Instead, she asked, what would you think about trying something new? We've been together for years, and everything's become so routine. I sighed, leaning back. That's normal, I said, brushing it off. It doesn't mean we need to start experimenting with things like that. She gave me a small nod, and the conversation ended there, but the topic lingered in the air. One evening, over dinner, my wife mentioned something new. Guess what? They're organizing a corporate event for the new employees, and of course, I'm invited. So, you'll have a chance to relax at home without me, she said with a playful smile. I looked at her and asked, how long are you planning to be out? She shrugged casually. Not too late, most likely back by evening. I've already gotten to know the team pretty well, and there are so many interesting people. When the evening of the event came, she dressed up and left, leaving me alone in the quiet house. I used the time to catch up on some tasks and unwind, but as hours passed, I started to feel uneasy. I decided to check in, so I called her to see how things were going. To my surprise, she didn't pick up. I tried again a little later, but still no answer. I frowned, wondering what was going on. By the time she returned home, it was late, and she seemed slightly tipsy. Why didn't you answer your phone? I asked as she walked through the door. She blinked at me, then let out a small laugh. Oh, you won't believe it. Jason and Emily are planning to throw a huge swinger party, she said, as if that explained everything. I stared at her, stunned by the casual way she dropped this information. Excuse me? I said, my voice hard. She met my gaze, her expression serious now. Yeah, they brought it up tonight. Don't worry, I already know I'm not going, she added quickly, seeing the look on my face. But tell me, why do you react so strongly to this kind of thing? She asked, her tone curious rather than defensive. I didn't hold back. Because it's basically cheating, I said firmly. She nodded thoughtfully. Okay, fair enough, she replied, dropping the subject for the moment. But as she settled onto the couch, she brought up something else. By the way, Emily's birthday is coming up soon, and I want to plan a big surprise with Jason for her. I raised an eyebrow, not entirely thrilled by the idea. And what kind of surprise are you planning? I asked. She hesitated, then said, well, since Emily checks his phone all the time, we'll probably need to meet somewhere neutral to plan everything without her finding out. My frown deepened. Should I come with you? I asked, trying to gauge the situation. She shook her head. It'll probably be right after work, so it'd be better if you stayed out of it, she said. Besides, I'll tell you all about it later. She looked at me, waiting for my response. I let out a sigh, not entirely convinced but too tired to argue further. All right, I said, though the unease didn't leave me. As she stood to head to bed, she added casually, I'll just need you to cover for me if anyone asks where I am. That line stayed with me long after she had gone upstairs. Over the next few weeks, my wife started coming home later and later, always with detailed stories about what she was working on. She described plans, strategies, and coordination efforts for the surprise party for Emily. It all sounded plausible, even impressive, but the frequency of her late nights started to bother me. Something about it didn't sit right. What really caught my attention was how she acted in the mornings. She'd wake up fine, moving around the house as usual, but after using the bathroom, she'd come out with a slight limp. It wasn't extreme, but it was noticeable. Out of curiosity, I asked her one morning if everything was all right. Yeah, why? She replied, her tone casual. You've been walking funny after leaving the bathroom, I said. She laughed it off, claiming she must have just slept in a weird position. Her response didn't entirely satisfy me, so on one of my days off, I decided to investigate. While she was at work, I went into the bathroom and searched every corner. Cabinets, drawers, the trash bin, I left no stone unturned. I was thorough but found nothing unusual. It only deepened my suspicion. By the time she got home that evening, I couldn't keep my thoughts to myself anymore. "Look," I said as she put down her bag, "this whole thing doesn't feel right. Why are you always late? And about that party, when did it happen?" She frowned, clearly annoyed. "You have trust issues," she said, crossing her arms. "I told you, we're working on this huge gift for Emily. It's taking a lot of effort." Her explanation was firm, but it didn't put me at ease. "Why can't you just bring everyone here and plan it at home?" I asked. That set her off. "What difference does it make?" she snapped. "Do you think I'm cheating on you? Just so you know, that party you're so worried about. It already happened, and I wasn't even there. I was at my mother's that night. Call her if you don't believe me." Her words hung in the air as I stared at her, unsure of what to say. She glared at me before storming off to the bedroom. Reluctantly, I picked up my phone and called her mother. To my surprise, her mother confirmed that she had indeed been there on the night of the party. I ended the call feeling a mix of guilt and unease. When I went to the bedroom to talk to her, she was already under the covers, facing away from me. "I can't believe you don't trust me," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "I'm going to sleep." I stood there for a moment, unsure of how to fix the situation, then left the room, the weight of the argument settling over the house. That morning, I woke up with a clear sense of purpose. If I wanted to figure out what was really going on, I needed to act discreetly. Confronting her directly hadn't worked, so it was time to dig deeper without drawing attention to myself. Her phone was always with her, but I knew her laptop might hold some answers. After she left for work, I decided to take a look. I opened her laptop and checked the usual places: email, messaging apps, and browser history. To my frustration, there was nothing suspicious. Her email contained only work-related correspondence, and her social media accounts seemed perfectly normal. Even her browsing history was clean, showing nothing out of the ordinary. It was like looking at the digital life of someone who had nothing to hide. By the time she got home that evening, I felt more frustrated than ever. She went to bed early, clearly still upset about the argument from the previous night. As I sat in the quiet living room, an idea struck me. Her phone was the only device left to check, and now that she was asleep, I had my chance. I crept into the bedroom and carefully picked up her phone from the nightstand. Unlocking it, I immediately noticed something odd. All her messages with Jason were gone. There wasn't a single text from him, which didn't make sense given how much time they spent working together. It was too clean, almost as if someone had deliberately erased their conversations. Feeling uneasy, I opened her chat with Emily. At first glance, it seemed normal, filled with casual banter and updates. But then I came across a message where Emily complained about Jason staying late at work. My wife had replied, saying she didn't know much about his schedule. That struck me as odd. If they were planning a big surprise together, wouldn't she have some idea of what he was up to? Scrolling further, I found another message where Emily mentioned being sick and staying home. That made me pause. If Emily was unwell, why hadn't my wife mentioned it? It seemed like the kind of thing she'd casually bring up in conversation. The pieces didn't add up, and the lack of clarity only made me more suspicious. As I locked her phone and returned it to its place, a thought crossed my mind. If I wanted answers, Emily might be the key. She was at home, likely resting, and might be willing to talk. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to learn more about what was going on. The next morning, I made up my mind. I'd pay Emily a visit, casually, of course, to check on her and maybe get some insight into what had been happening. If anyone could shed light on the situation, it was her. The morning began like many others recently, with my wife limping slightly as she left for work. It was becoming harder to ignore the strangeness of her behavior. After she left, I decided to act on my suspicions. I drove straight to Emily's place, determined to get some clarity. When she opened the door, she looked surprised to see me. "Hey, what's going on?" she asked. "We need to talk," I said firmly. Her expression shifted, and she gestured for me to come inside. Once we were seated, she asked, "What's this about?" I didn't hold back. "It's about your boyfriend," I began. "Something's not adding up. My wife keeps saying she's working late planning a birthday surprise for you, but when I checked her phone, there was nothing, no messages, no evidence of this planning. I'm starting to think she's cheating on me with your boyfriend." Emily's face fell, and she leaned back in her chair. "I've had those thoughts too," she admitted quietly. "There have been moments when things didn't seem right. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions." I nodded, relieved to have someone on the same page. "If you have any of his devices, we should check them," I suggested. She hesitated, then said, "I do have his other phone. I know the password. Give me a minute." She left the room and returned with the phone. Unlocking it, she handed it over, and I began scrolling through the messages. To my shock, the conversations between Jason and my wife were intact. As I read, the reality of the situation sank in. Not only were they planning a gift for Emily, but they were also having an affair. The messages were explicit and left no room for doubt. Emily leaned over, reading along with me. Her expression hardened as she saw the texts. "Unbelievable," she muttered. But what really pushed us over the edge was a message from Jason asking about condoms. My wife had replied, saying they were hidden in a special place where I'd never find them. The final blow came when we uncovered a series of messages revealing that she had attended another swinger party, one Emily knew nothing about. I looked at Emily, trying to gauge her reaction. "What do you want to do?" I asked. She thought for a moment before saying, "I want payback." That was all I needed to hear. "All right," I said. "Do you have any leverage on him? Anything we can use?" Emily's eyes lit up with determination. "Actually, yes. We've talked a lot about his work. He's always complaining about his boss and has 2 formal warnings on his record. But that's not all." She opened his video gallery, and we both froze as we saw footage from a swinger party. Among the clips was something incriminating. Jason had recorded the boss's wife participating in the event. "This is gold," I said, unable to hide my excitement. "This could change everything." Emily nodded. "I'll save the videos and keep everything secure," she said. "What's the plan?" I thought for a moment. "For now, act like everything's normal. Don't give them any reason to suspect anything. I'll let you know when it's time to use this." She agreed, her expression steely with resolve. Satisfied, I stood to leave. "Keep me updated," I said as I headed for the door. Emily nodded. "You got it." I drove home, my mind racing with thoughts of what was to come and how this new information would play out. When I got home, the house was quiet. My wife still hadn't returned, and I decided to wait. Sitting in the living room, I replayed the events of the day in my mind, trying to piece everything together. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Just as I was about to give up for the night, I heard the front door creak open. She stumbled in, clearly drunk, her steps uneven and clumsy. At first, I just watched her silently, but then something caught my attention. There was a strange trail running down her leg, and my instincts kicked in. "Stop right there," I barked, rising to my feet. She froze, startled by my tone. "What?" she slurred, trying to steady herself. I pointed at her and said firmly, "Jump." She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you insane?" "Why would I jump?" she yelled. "Just do it," I demanded, my voice leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, she complied, hopping awkwardly in place. That's when it happened. 3 used condoms slipped out from under her dress and hit the floor. The sight left me momentarily speechless. My mind raced to process what I was seeing, but before I could say a word, she launched into a tirade. Her face twisted with anger, and she jabbed a finger in my direction. "This is your fault," she screamed, her voice shaking. "You drove me to this. You're supposed to take care of me, provide for me, and make this marriage work. That's your job as a man." Her words were slurred and venomous, but they didn't distract from the evidence lying on the floor between us. Each syllable she spat only fueled the fire growing inside me. I felt a wave of anger surge through me, hot and uncontrollable. "Enough," I said, my voice low but steady. Without another word, I stormed to the bedroom and started grabbing her belongings. Clothes, shoes, and anything else I could find went straight into garbage bags. She followed me, still yelling, her accusations becoming more incoherent with every step. Her voice grated on my nerves, but I refused to engage further. By the time I finished, the hallway was filled with bags. I dragged them to the front door and tossed them outside one by one. Each thud as the bags hit the porch felt like a small victory. She stood there, screaming insults and threats, her voice rising with every passing second. But I'd had enough. "Get out," I said firmly, pointing to the door. "You're not staying here another night." Her rage reached a new level as she stepped out onto the porch. "You think this is over?" she shouted, her voice echoing into the night. "I'll be back, and when I am, you'll regret this. I'll make sure of it." Her words were a mix of anger and desperation, a thinly veiled threat that did little to intimidate me. I watched her for a moment, my expression unreadable, before stepping back inside and shutting the door. I locked it behind me with a satisfying click. As I leaned against the door, the house felt strangely quiet again. The adrenaline that had fueled me moments ago began to ebb, leaving a heavy exhaustion in its place. Her threats lingered in my mind, a shadow of the chaos that had just unfolded. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control returning. Whatever came next, I'd face it on my own terms. The night stretched ahead, quiet and still, and for now, that was enough. After discovering the videos on Jason's phone, I wasted no time. I called Emily immediately, my voice steady but urgent. "Listen," I said. "You need to send those videos to his boss right now. Don't wait. And once you've done that, lock your doors and stay inside. We don't know how he'll react when he finds out." She hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. "All right," she said. "I'll do it and stay home. Thank you for letting me know." Minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was my wife, her voice shaking with fury. "Why did you do this?" she demanded. "You just cost me my job. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I didn't bother hiding my disdain. "You've got some nerve calling me," I said coldly. "You brought this on yourself. First, you cheated on me, then you went to those swinger parties behind your friend's back. You think there wouldn't be consequences?" She didn't back down. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "Both of you will. You don't know who you're messing with." The call ended abruptly, her threat hanging in the air. I stared at the phone for a moment before setting it down. There was no going back now. Later that evening, I parked down the street from Emily's house, waiting for her signal. The plan was simple: make sure she was safe and move her somewhere they wouldn't find her easily. I wasn't taking any chances after my wife's outburst. When Emily finally texted me to say the videos had been sent, I pulled up to her driveway and knocked on the door. "It's done," she said as she opened the door, her face pale but resolute. "The boss has the videos. I'm just hoping this doesn't spiral out of control." I nodded, stepping inside. "Good. Now listen, we need to leave. Jason and my wife are furious, and it's not safe for you to stay here alone. They'll come looking for you." She looked at me, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Are you sure?" she asked hesitantly. "What if they try something at your place?" I shook my head. They won't risk coming to my house. It's better than staying here. Trust me on this. She glanced around her home, as if weighing her options, before finally nodding. All right, she said. Let me grab a few things. While she gathered her belongings, I kept an eye on the street, scanning for any sign of Jason or my wife. The neighborhood was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were racing against the clock. When Emily returned with a small bag in hand, I led her to the car, double-checking that the doors were locked before pulling away. The drive back to my house was tense. Emily stared out the window, her expression unreadable. I broke the silence after a few minutes. Don't worry, I said. We'll figure this out. They've already shown their hand, and now we have the upper hand. She glanced at me, her lips pressing into a thin line. I just want this to be over, she murmured. As we pulled into my driveway, the weight of the day began to settle over us. Emily let out a small sigh of relief. Thank you, she said softly. For everything. I nodded, gesturing for her to follow me inside. The house felt like a safe haven now, a temporary refuge from the chaos outside. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. The next day, as the sun hung low in the sky, the calm of the house was shattered by a knock at the door. My wife's voice rang out from the other side, demanding I come out. We need to talk, she shouted. Beside her stood Jason, his stance aggressive, his face twisted with anger. I stayed put, watching through the window as their frustration grew. Open the door, coward. Jason yelled, banging his fist against the frame. I remained silent, my mind racing. I know you're in there, he shouted again. My wife's voice joined in, laced with venom. You think you can get away with this? She screamed. I took a deep breath and moved toward the door, my resolve firm. Go away, I said loudly enough for them to hear through the closed door. You're not welcome here. My words seemed to ignite Jason further. If you don't open this door, I'll make my own way in, he snarled. Moments later, the sound of metal smashing against glass filled the air. He had grabbed a crowbar and shattered one of the front windows, sending shards flying across the room. I acted quickly, ushering Emily into a bedroom and locking the door behind her. Stay here, I instructed. Don't come out until I say it's safe. She nodded, fear etched across her face. With her secure, I went to retrieve the handgun I kept locked away for emergencies. Adrenaline coursed through me as I loaded it, my hands steady despite the chaos. Jason was already inside by the time I stepped into the hallway, the crowbar still in his hand. There you are, he sneered. You're gonna pay for what you did. He took a step toward me, his movements aggressive and threatening. I raised the gun, aiming it squarely at him. Don't come any closer, I warned, my voice cold and unwavering. You don't have the guts, he spat, taking another step. I'll beat you to a pulp and make you regret every second of this. My grip tightened on the gun. This is your last warning, I said firmly. But he ignored me, breaking into a sprint. Before I could think, my finger pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house, and Jason collapsed to the floor, clutching his stomach in agony. My wife screamed, rushing to his side. What did you do? She cried, tears streaming down her face. I kept the gun trained on him, stepping back slowly to maintain distance. Stay where you are, I commanded, grabbing my phone and dialing 911. I need police and an ambulance immediately, I said into the phone. There's been a break-in, and the intruder's been shot. Within minutes, sirens filled the air. Police officers arrived, securing the scene and taking my statement. Paramedics followed, tending to Jason as he groaned in pain. My wife's fury was palpable as she turned to me, her voice trembling with rage. You'll pay for this, she hissed before storming out of the house. As she disappeared into the night, the tension in the air began to dissipate, leaving only the cold reality of what had just transpired. The officers assured me they would handle everything from here, but the weight of the event hung heavy in the air. Watching the ambulance pull away with Jason inside, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Whatever the aftermath, I knew I had done what was necessary to protect my home. In the aftermath of the chaotic confrontation, the divorce proceedings moved surprisingly quickly. Both of us wanted it done and over with, and there wasn't much to fight over. She took what she wanted, and I kept the house. The process was straightforward, and within weeks, we were legally separated. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of freedom, as if a heavy weight had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Jason's situation, however, wasn't so simple. His actions that night didn't go unnoticed by the law. Breaking into my home and attempting to assault me landed him in serious trouble. The police charged him with breaking and entering, along with attempted assault. During the trial, the evidence against him was clear, and the judge didn't hesitate to hand down a sentence. He was convicted and faced jail time, ensuring he wouldn't be causing trouble anytime soon. As for me, the court ruled in my favor. It was determined that I acted in self-defense, and all charges against me were dropped. The decision brought a sense of closure to the entire ordeal, solidifying that I had done what was necessary to protect myself and my home. Despite everything, I tried not to dwell on the past. I was ready to move forward. During this time, Emily and I grew closer. Our shared experiences created a bond that neither of us had expected. We began spending more time together, first as friends, then as something more. She was a refreshing presence in my life, honest and straightforward, with none of the deceit that had plagued my marriage. One evening, as we sat talking over dinner, she made her stance clear. "No games, no swinger parties, none of that nonsense," she said with a wry smile. "Just trust and honesty." I couldn't agree more. Our relationship blossomed naturally. It felt different from what I had with my ex-wife, simpler, calmer, and built on mutual respect. Emily's directness was something I valued deeply, and we both made it clear that there would be no secrets between us. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe easily. Life was starting to look brighter. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from my ex-wife. Her voice dripped with bitterness as she launched into a tirade. "You're a piece of work," she sneered. "Hooking up with my friend? Do you have any idea how humiliating that is for me?" I listened silently, letting her vent. When she finally paused, I replied evenly, "You lost the right to care about what I do when you cheated. Move on." Her reaction was predictably explosive, and she slammed the phone down before I could say anything else. I couldn't help but feel a pang of satisfaction. Her attempts to control the narrative no longer held any power over me. Emily and I discussed the call later, both agreeing that her outbursts were best ignored. "She'll get over it eventually," Emily said with a shrug, her tone dismissive. Life settled into a new rhythm, one that felt steady and secure. Emily and I focused on building something meaningful together, free from the toxicity of the past. While the scars of what had happened remained, they served as a reminder of how far I'd come. Trust and honesty became the foundation of our relationship, and with each passing day, I grew more confident that this time, things would be different.